On your exploration of the canals in Vivek City, you notice that they're not exactly uninhabited, being filled with a variety of unfriendly creatures, from rats to angry Nords. But still you progress through the canals in search of something interesting. As with most cities, it is what is hidden beneath that is most intriguing. On your search through these canals, you come across a shrine, this being filled with some rather unfriendly worshippers. After teaching them some manners, the statue says to you,
"What is it, mortal? Have you come to be of service to Sheogorath? That in and of itself speaks toward your madness."
Hello and welcome to Anatomy of Fiction. In today's video, we will be discussing the Daedric Prince Sheogorath. More specifically, why would anyone worship him? To do this, we will go over several things. Firstly, who even is Sheogorath? So what is he often known as, by who and why? Then we will move on to the history of Sheogorath. So what historical events has he been involved in and what is his legacy? Next, we will move into what is Sheogorath god over. In this, we will discuss who worships him and how do they worship him. After this, we will move on to Sheogorath's creations. So, the Shivering Isles along with the various artifacts associated with him throughout the series. Finally, we will move into Sheogorath's curse. But firstly, we should start with introducing Sheogorath. So who actually is Sheogorath? Well, to the Dunmeri people, Sheogorath is the fourth corner of the House of Troubles, this being the bad Daedra in their pantheon. They are the enemy gods that exist to test the Dunmer people. Sheogorath in the House of Troubles is seen as the king of madness. His specific purpose as the fourth corner is to test people for mental weakness. In Dunmer legend, he is called upon by one faction to be used against another. However, in half of these legends, he does betray who called upon him. So it's a bit of a 50-50 chance that calling upon him is actually a good idea. Sheogorath is also known by many other names. The names range from the general terms like God of Madness and the Trickster, to those a little more obscure, like that of the name Cheese Prince. Now the name Cheese Prince does come from another Daedric lord by the name of Sanguine. This was whilst he was undercover, appearing as a Breton by the name of Samuel Vorone. This was during the celebration of Sheogorath, more specifically the Jester's Festival. Sanguine would refer to him as the Cheese Prince, which is where this specific term comes from. Now moving on. He does also go by other names, like Skooma Cat. However, this is specifically related to Khajiit worship of the Daedra and their beliefs surrounding Sheogorath. With Skooma Cat, they believe that Sheogorath appears to them as a cat with a crooked tail. This cat shares his madness with Sugar Tooths, this being through Skooma. We also see him as the gentleman with a cane in various other versions or descriptions of Sheogorath. Now this comes from the regularly used disguise where he appears as a well-dressed gentleman who happens to use a cane. This is supposed to be a more seemingly harmless appearance, so people don't realize he is, a bit of a mad god. However, considering it's an often used disguise, it's kind of been given away already. Now that we know a bit about who Sheogorath is, we should move on to the historical events that Sheogorath is involved in. When it comes to the history of Sheogorath, we first see him appearing in the First Era. So this appearance centers around the island of Ivea. The sanctuary and retreat on the island of Ivea was established early in the First Era. This was for all mages. This was created by Shalador, who also established the College of Winterhold. Now, the establishment of the various parts of the island of Ivea is not where Sheogorath was involved. No, instead he comes into play around the 23rd century of the First Era. Now, in this century, Shalador decided to make a little bet against Sheogorath. If Shalador won, he would be given the Folium Discognitum. However, if Shalador lost, he would hand over Ivea to Sheogorath, allowing for it to become part of the Shivering Isles. Shalador, of course, lost the wager against Sheogorath. This would lead to the island being teleported to the Shivering Isles. Thankfully, all of the information in the libraries would not be lost, however. This was not due to Shalador, nor was it due to Sheogorath. Instead, it would be due to the diligent work of Ulfsild, who would manage to collect the knowledge from the library and would manage to escape just before the island would be whisked away to the Shivering Isles. Now, this is not the last time that Sheogorath would play a hand in the events of mortals during the First Era. No, there would also be that of the Cold Harbour Compact. This occurred between the 3rd and 5th days of Rain's Hand in the year 2920. This is where several of the Daedric princes would travel to Cold Harbour to meet with Suthersil. Suthersil being the tribunal god. This Cold Harbour compact is believed to be what prevents the various Daedric princes from directly appearing on Nirn, instead appearing through statues or other vessels, as they are no longer allowed to directly meddle in the lives of mortals. There is no recorded reason as to why the Daedric princes agreed to this deal, but it is suggested that Suthersil either made them an offer they couldn't refuse, or made a threat that was credible and large enough to keep them away from Nirn. Now we move into the Second Era. This occurred before the year 582. The event more specifically being the creation of the Umbra, which is a magical sword. Now, the creation story behind this sword, depending on the belief, can include Sheogorath, but we will get to that. So the creation of the Umbra sword came from a task that Clavicus Vile, the Daedric Prince of Trickery and Bargains, would request from the witch known as Naenra Wea, who was said to be a very talented witch and crafter. So this sword was supposed to be a tool of mischief that could be used to send souls to the fields of regrets, which is Clavicus Vile's realm in Oblivion. So Naenra would create the sword. However, this sword would be very unstable. This would lead to Naenra going back to Clavicus Vile to tell him the issue with the sword and would ask him for his assistance with fixing it. This would lead to her suggesting to the Daedric Prince that part of his power was needed to be given to her to make the sword stable. But unbeknownst to Clavicus Vile, there was a second reason to needing his power. Now this would actually be a trick. Yes, this was done to make the sword a sentient being who would give himself the name of Umbra. Once this deceit was found out, Naenra would be executed for what she did. However, not before hiding the sword. The sword has been found on several occasions, and once wielded by someone deemed worthy, it slowly begins to take over them, controlling those who wield it. But how exactly does an evil sentient sword relate to Sheogorath? Well, in some tales related to the sword, it is said that Naenra was actually Sheogorath in a very clever disguise, considering that he, the god of madness, managed to trick the god of trickery. But anyway, moving on. Sheogorath was actually rather busy in the Second Era, with the next event in the timeline being that of the return of Shalador. So Shalador, who originally had never had any interaction with the Mages Guild, considering he was actually long dead before they came around, he would team up with the Mages Guild in the year 582 to attempt to bring the island of Ivea back to the mortal plane. This would be through the hard work of several people, including Velast, who would spend her time translating the tomes, which would allow for the Mages Guild and Shalador to open a portal to bring Ivea back to the mortal realm. So they would be successful in bringing Ivea back to where it belonged. However, not without consequences. You know what they say? No good deed goes unpunished. With this, there would be a few problems, the first of these being that there would be several Daedric Guardians remaining on the island. Now these Guardians were there as a test before Sheogorath would actually fully hand back the island to the mortal realm. The Guardians would guard the portals that connected Ivea to the Shivering Isles, with the connections needing to be severed by the Vestige, while Shalador would attempt to reopen the guild hall on the island as it was sealed shut. With the Vestige's success in closing these portals, they would meet Shalador back at the guild hall. Now this is where Sheogorath would reappear confronting the group. He would force the Vestige and Haskill to fight, Haskill being his chamberlain, which is essentially the person who manages the household of a royal, or in this case, a Daedric prince. After the Vestige won in the duel, Sheogorath would relinquish his claim on Ivea. But he would bring everyone's attention to the other problem that this little quest had caused. Velast had begun to act differently, saying some rather odd things. As it turns out, this was all a part of Sheogorath's plan. So he had used the tomes that Velast translated to begin to drive her mad, and she was now transcended into a state of complete madness. So Sheogorath offers the Vestige a deal, this being a reference to the original deal that he had offered Shalador all of those years ago. The Vestige could choose Velast's sanity, so Sheogorath would cure what he had done to her, or the Vestige could choose the Folium Discognitum, ending the saga that started all of those years ago. This of course being at the cost of Velast's sanity and leading to her being taken by Sheogorath to the Shivering Isles. However, the decision of the Vestige to this day remains unknown, so the fate of Velast is unknown. But anyway, moving on to the other events that Sheogorath had been involved in the Second Era. he would leave the Mages Guild alone and instead turn his attention to the coastal city of South Point over in Valen Wood. Now this was no beach holiday for Sheogorath. No, he still had scheming to do. So in this lovely city, Sheogorath would meet up with a disgruntled mayor, Mayor Aulus, who claimed that he had lost his birthright. Now this mayor would make demands of Sheogorath, but Sheogorath, being the ever so helpful god he is, would provide his own solution to the mayor's problems. He would gift the mayor with a curse for his tongue. Now this curse would turn people mad, which would then lead to the entirety of South Point going mad. This, along with the mayor, of course, becoming mad with power, being obsessed with the idea that the city he was supposedly ruling over should bow to him, as they had done to the previous generations of his family. The Vestige would put an end to this madness plaguing the city of South Point and end the rule of Mayor Aulus. With this, Sheogorath would leave the city and head to Anaquina, to the Two Moons at Tenmar Temple. So this temple was dedicated to the two moons of Neon, these being Jode and Joan. This temple was led by the moon bishop Cisenza. She would have visions that would help lead the worshippers and other members of the temple, but over time her visions had begun to grow stranger and stranger. With Cisenza beginning to use skooma, her actions and her orders for her followers would also grow weirder and weirder, to the point that she would demand the walls to have cheese smeared all over them, and that the temple fires would be extinguished by the tongues of the members. Yeah, pro tip, don't go licking fire. It burns, because it's hot. These demands would exacerbate to the point of the members being advised to poke their eyes out with the fork of horripilation, as this is how they could prevent the dragons from seeing them, because this area was plagued by dragons. Well, as it turns out, these visions that Cisenza had been having and orders she had been giving due to them were due to, of course, Sheogorath trying to spice things up at the temple. Thankfully, with the Vestige also intervening, no one would lose an eye to the roast beef scented iron fork. Now we move into the Third Era. This is where we see Sheogorath around the year 405 inviting an agent of the Blades on a quest. He would send the agent of the Blades on a quest to get rid of a battle mage that he did not like. In return, he would reward the Agent of the Blades with an artifact known as the Wabberjack. Now the Wabberjack is no normal staff, as it was a gift from the god of chaos and madness. Its traits, of course, very much promote this. By using this staff on a random creature, it can cause it to turn into numerous creatures, from anything as minor as a rat or a bat, all the way to, say, a fire Atronak or even a lich. However, there is no control over what the creature is transformed into, as that would be too orderly. No, this is just random on hit. Now we should move on to Sheogorath's interaction with the Nerevarine in the year 427 in the Third Era. Sheogorath would task the Nerevarine with the maddening task of killing a Netch with a fork. But not just any fork, no, the fork of horripilation. Yes, the beefy two-pronged fork does make a comeback in the Third Era. So, Sheogorath sends the Nerevarine to meet with one of his followers, Big Head the Argonian.
What is it, mortal? Have you come to be of service to Sheogorath? That in and of itself speaks toward your madness. This pleases me. Fetch the Fork of Horripilation from the Mad Hermit near Alredania. Take care with him. He's not the most stable man. Use the fork wisely, mortal. Few have wielded it who have not come away changed. Use the fork to strike a death blow to the giant Bull Netch that resides near the hermit. Do this, return the Fork of Horripilation to me, and Sheogorath will reward you well.
The Nerevarine would go on this quest, succeeding in killing the Netch. For this, they would be greatly rewarded. Sheogorath would provide them with the Spear of Bitter Mercy, which, interestingly enough, no one knew how he would come into possession of this Daedric artifact, considering this item is often a weapon of choice when it comes to another Daedric prince, that being Hircine. Now we move on to the year 433 with the hero of Kvatch and over to the Khajiit settlement of Border Watch, this being located in Cyrodiil. This is where Sheogorath would mimic a Khajiit prophecy of Kashara, as he felt the town was just rather dull. Now this prophecy was supposed to spell out the end of all days for the world, which is what drew Sheogorath's interest, with a belief that this would cause chaos and fear. He would use the 3 phases of the prophecy to make the Khajiits of Board Watch believe that the world that they knew it was over. The first stage of this prophecy was rats swarming the town. Then the second would be having their livestock suddenly die. And the third, of course, this being the Plague of Fear. In this third stage, Sheogorath would use a rain of burning dogs to invoke fear and belief that the world was ending, whilst he was merely just being entertained by the fear of the villagers. Now, at the very end of the third era, Sheogorath would also attempt to deal with the threat of Grey March. This being the event where the Daedric Prince Sheogorath would come to the Shivering Isles and attempt to essentially destroy them. Well, Sheogorath wanted to prevent that, considering it meant the destruction of his realm, so he would create a portal between Niben Bay, which is a large body of water in Cyrodiil, and the Shivering Isles. Now, this portal technically did not break the Cold Harbor Compact, as it was an invitation to Sheogorath's plane in Oblivion, rather than an invasion into Nian. With this, the hero of Kvatch would mantle Sheogorath as a way of taking on Jiggalag and the forces of order to prevent them from destroying the Shivering Isles. By the hero of Kvatch challenging Jiggalag whilst mantling Sheogorath, he would break the curse that connected the Daedric Princes. Now we move on to the fourth era. This is the story of Talem Rend. Now, Talem Rend went to Sheogorath in an attempt to bargain with him for his help in forgetting his hand in the death of his son, as Talem, being a spy, attempted to infiltrate the Worm cult. To do this, he was forced to kill his own son to prove his loyalty. Now, Talem was ruined by the guilt, which would lead to him traveling to the Shivering Isles in an attempt to seek out Sheogorath. Initially, Sheogorath was not interested in him, so he denied him the opportunity to speak. Haskill recommended to Talem that he should go around the Shivering Isles and do various deeds in an attempt to just entertain Sheogorath. After completing several deeds in the Shivering Isles, Haskill would tell Talem that Sheogorath wished to see him. In this meeting, Sheogorath and Talem would strike a deal. Talem's memories in the involvement of his son's death would be wiped, this being in return for Talem driving 3 souls to the point of madness. Well, little did Talem know that Sheogorath had slight changes to this little plan. So instead of wiping Talem's role in his son's death from his memories, Sheogorath would change his memories completely, so that Talem believed his son was actually still alive, and he was instead fighting for his son's sanity. Once Talem achieved his goal and relearned of his son's death after returning home, he would realize that Sheogorath had lied to him and betrayed him. So Talem would travel to the Shivering Isles and request to see Sheogorath again. But Sheogorath was of course not interested. He was done playing with Talem. So Talem would walk around the Shivering Isles aimlessly. Eventually, with this, he would attack a former companion of his on the isle. After wounding them, he would snap out of his state of madness. From this companion, he would hear a strange rumor. This rumor being about a powerful warrior being trapped in Knife Point Hollow. So he would head to Knife Point Hollow in an attempt to get help with his issue. Here he would find Daius, the librarian of Jiggalag, and Daius would tell him that there actually may be a way to get Sheogorath's attention. This would be through the use of the Sword of Jiggalag. So once Talem retrieved the sword, he would finally be granted an audience with Sheogorath. Now this would not be a nice reunion. Instead, Sheogorath would use the memory wand to restore Talem's memories, and would also mock him for his original request. But Talem, after spending much of his time chasing Sheogorath, would not take this lightly. No! He would turn the memory wand on Sheogorath and bring back Sheogorath's own missing memories. This would remind him of his connection to Jiggalag. So Sheogorath would beg for Talem to stop using the memory wand against him. And for this, he would hold up his original end of the bargain, along with freeing him and his companions from the Shivering Isles. Now we move on to the year 180 in the 4th era. This is where we see the Mad Breton who went by the name of Theodore Gorlash. He would appear in the town of Rivercrest. Now Theodore Gorlash would encourage the warrior to enter a portal that had appeared just outside of the town. Because why not enter a strange doorway? What could go wrong? Well, as it turned out, this portal opened up to the Abyss, which happens to be a mysterious realm within Oblivion. This abyss being a never-ending maze of corridors and rooms which form an endless dungeon. Now the reason why Sheogorath is important in the case of this event is that Theodore Gorlash may be no normal Breton. Yes, he was mad, but not normal for a different reason. He instead is suggested to be Sheogorath, this being for several reasons. Firstly, his name is actually an anagram of Sheogorath. He also bears an interesting resemblance to the Daedric Prince, both having the unnatural golden eyes. Along with this, if you ask others in the town about him, they won't know who you are talking about, which is what often happens with Sheogorath's various appearances, as he apparently only appears to the mad. so Theodore Gorlash may instead be Sheogorath in disguise. But anyway, into the year 201. This is where the last Dragonborn would encounter a Bosmer man by the name of Deravin. Now Deravin looked just like a regular street beggar. However, he was previously a high priest of Mania. Now he would task the last Dragonborn with a quest. He would request that the last Dragonborn find his missing master. Now the last Dragonborn, not realizing what this quest would entail, would agree to helping the old man out. So the last Dragonborn would have to enter the mind of the recently deceased Pelagus Septim III. This is where he would encounter Sheogorath, who they would ask to go back to the Shivering Isles. Sheogorath would make them a deal, escape the mind of Pelagus, and he would return to his plane in oblivion. Sheogorath would help the last Dragonborn with their journey through Pelagus' mind by providing them the Wabberjack and providing them some direction. After Pelagus' mind was conquered, the last Dragonborn would return to Tamriel, and Sheogorath would return to the Shivering Isles. Now we should discuss what exactly is Sheogorath god of, along with who worships him and why and how he is worshipped. So Sheogorath is the Daedric Prince of Madness. Along with this comes his love for several things, including torture. A great example of this comes from his love of butterflies. Well, love is a little bit of a stretch, considering he admits to spending the first few thousand years of his life terrorizing butterflies. There is also another example, this being the myth surrounding Sheogorath's gift of music. With typical Sheogorath fashion, his creation of instruments were done in a somewhat interesting manner. In this myth, he would want to bring more interest to the lives of mortals. So he would ask himself what he could do to make the lives of mortals more interesting. Now what he did not count on was a woman nearby answering that the birds sound beautiful, which would inspire Sheogorath to create the first instruments out of the woman. Yes, he made the first instruments out of the woman who answered him. How lovely. So yeah, torture is very much one of his favorite pastimes. But anyway, Sheogorath is worshipped primarily by two cultures. However, he does have followers throughout different races. The first of these cultures being the Khajiit. This is with their belief in the skooma cat, being called the skooma cat because there is nothing madder than a cat on skooma. Now the skooma cat or Sheogorath comes from the origins as all other gods or god cats do, this being that they are the children of Anhur and Fadomai. With Khajiiti belief about Sheogorath, there are several different beliefs about what his purpose is, or has been throughout time. Some in more ancient times believe that he was an obstacle in their path that must be overcome before they were to make it to Hermora's library. Now Hermora's library is a plane in oblivion that is ruled over by another Daedra, known as Hermaeus Mora. On this path, Sheogorath was said to make Khajiits doubt the truth in their own beliefs, actions and thoughts, which once they overcame this, they were free of obstructions towards their afterlife. In other ancient Khajiit tribes, there was also the belief that Sheogorath had actually died and he was instead replaced by something else. But who knows what? In more recent times, in Khajiit mythology, this is where Sheogorath becomes the skooma cat associated with the hallucinatory beverage skooma. Skooma cat presents as an Alfiq, these being the Khajiits that appear as regular house cats, but skooma cat also often has behaviors that are more aligned with a regular house cat than an Alfiq would, like that of being distracted by yarn or string. So in Khajiit mythology, Sheogorath is considered to be one of the major Daedric princes. But there are also the Chaima or Dunmer who worship Sheogorath. The Dunmer know him as the Prince of Fools. Now, when it comes to the Dunmer, the act of worshipping Sheogorath is actually considered to be illegal, as this is an act against the tribunal temple. The worshipping of Sheogorath or other members of the House of Troubles is considered to be an act punishable by death because of his and the others' rebellion against the temple. Sheogorath's rebellion specifically, according to the Pilgrim's Path, would come in the form of inspiring the moon, known as Bardal, to change course from its normal course in oblivion, instead inspiring it to hurl itself into Vivek City. This was because Sheogorath believed that Vivek City was built to mock the heavens. But as we all know, the plan to convince the moon, Bardal, was not successful in the destruction of Vivek City, well, for quite some time at least. This being due to Vivek, the tribunal god, stopping the moon by holding it above the city in a suspended state with his magic. With this magic disappearing, Bardal obviously would crash into the city. But anyway, this being why it is illegal to worship Sheogorath. However, he is still worshipped by some Dunmer. There is also the practice related to the worship of the tribunal temple known as the Pilgrimage of the Four Corners. The pilgrimage was a renewal of an agreement between Vivek and Sheogorath. This agreement would prevent Sheogorath from turning worshippers of the temple mad. Now, there were others who also worship Sheogorath, including in varied practices where everyone, for a day, worships Sheogorath. This is a sort of festival known as the Jester's Festival. This occurs on the 28th day of Rain's Hand. There is speculation that the celebration comes from the whole world being turned mad at some point, by Sheogorath of course. This being one of the possible origins suggested by Jester Queen Ariane. With this festival, it is filled with various pranks and chaotic activities, like stealing pigs and crowning them as royalty, or throwing rose petals at grumpy people. Now with this, there is also the Shivering Isles aspect of the worship. Here, there are two cults surrounding the worship of Sheogorath, this being the Zealot cult and the Heretic cult. The Zealots are a group in the Dementia region of the Shivering Isles. They are rather aggressive and believe that Sheogorath is a living god, whereas the Heretics are a hostile group of mages living on the Mania side of the Shivering Isles that believe Sheogorath is instead a mortal man who pretends to be a god. The Heretics instead believe that Arden Sul, who was the first Duke of the Shivering Isles, is the true god of the Shivering Isles and not Sheogorath. Along with others who worship Sheogorath, there is also the various rumours you hear in the winds of the Shivering Isles about another group who worship Sheogorath, these being a group of violent and primitive humanoids known as the Grummites. Now, they are also speculated to be a creation of Sheogorath. They are also believed to be the original inhabitants of the Shivering Isles. But the worshipping of Sheogorath are rumours, as no one has really gotten close enough to the Grummites, as they are not exactly the kind of people you would have over for afternoon tea. But anyway, on the topic of Grummites, we should discuss some of Sheogorath's creations. When it comes to Sheogorath's creations, there are many artifacts that he has created, along with, of course, his own realm in Oblivion. So we should start with his realm in Oblivion, this being the Shivering Isles. The Shivering Isles itself is known by several names, including the Madhouse and the Realm of Madness, and this being for good reason. After all, this place does happen to cause insanity for those who are trapped there, or at least aid in their descent into insanity, if they weren't already on the path there. Now, the Shivering Isles are split into two main areas along with a third smaller area. The smaller area is known as the Fringe. This is the waiting or testing area of the Shivering Isles. Those who desire to be tested seek out the Gatekeeper to gain access to the rest of the Shivering Isles once proving themselves. These other areas are the representations of the different sides of Sheogorath. The first, of course, being Mania, the bright and more light-hearted side of Sheogorath. The region is covered with beautiful grasslands and large mushroom trees, looking a bit like a sort of Willy Wonka type creation. Whereas the other part of the island, Dementia, is the opposite. This represents the darker, more violent side we see of Sheogorath. With this landscape, it is much darker and more swamp-like, with some dark forest as well, and some bogs. So it's not very, nice, sunshiny days. It's just, oh, this is sad, this is dark, this is boring. Along with the citizens here being the opposite of those on the Mania side, those on the Dementia side are pretty, depressed. Those on the Mania side are constantly happy, whereas those on the Dementia side are depressed. Sheogorath is also known for his many artifacts, including the Folium Discognitum, which many have desired over time. This book is supposed to hold knowledge. The book itself is filled with the ramblings of various madmen who provided their so-called insights for this tome. Along with this being nearly impossible to read, as both the writing is almost illegible and it moves around the page attempting to hide from the eyes of its reader, it, however, for those who manage to read it, grants immense power. For those who don't feel like attempting to read the scribbles of madmen, there are also other artifacts that Sheogorath has invented, including the Fork of Horripilation, also known as Forky by Sheogorath. Now, little Forky has several special side effects. It is known to either completely drain the magicka of the mortal user or just stunt it. It is also known to cause an interesting side effect in mortals just by touching it, this being horripilation, or as you may know it, goosebumps. Yes, it is the Fork of Goosebumps. We also have the Memory Wand. Now, this special little wand allows Sheogorath to edit the memories of those he chooses to use it upon, which can be done in a way to, of course, make the victim go mad, as he can cause them to relive a painful memory constantly. He can change how memories are to that person, or he can even delete memories. With this, he can completely change who a person is based on their memories if he so chooses. We see this with Talem, with him believing, obviously, his son was not dead, just crazy, but him, of course, being dead due to the hand of Talem. So it would drive Talem crazy when he found out about his son's death, eventually, for the second time, of course. And another one of Sheogorath's great creations is, of course, the Wabberjack. Now, the Wabberjack, it produces numerous effects, really depending on how lucky the user is. It can cause numerous effects like transforming an enemy into a docile creature, or it can even transform a weak enemy into a powerful monster. An interesting point to this is there is an occasional food item you can find known as wabba jerky. This is made out of the docile animals that were once human prior to their transformation, which brings up the question, does this count as cannibalism due to their previous form being, human or humanoid? Now, these alone are not the only effects we see from the wabbajack. It can also have the power to heal someone, damage them, turn them into stone, or instantly kill them. It is just kind of the luck of the draw with this one, so I wouldn't recommend it for, medical purposes. These are just some of the many creations of Sheogorath, with many others created to hinder. An example of one of these artifacts that hinder is the Everscamp staff. With this specific item, there is a belief it may be related to Nimira, this being due to the inscription near where the staff is found having Nimira's name. However, who created the staff is slightly murky, considering it is often attributed to Sheogorath, especially because of its effects. Now, this staff is interesting, as like the name suggests, using it summons Everscamps, which are essentially scamps that are ever present. Even in death, they reappear. This staff also has other effects, like slowing down its user, and also compelling the person using it not to get rid of it. After all, it could be a great family heirloom. How nice would it look above the fireplace? You never know when you might need it later on. This only being disposable if returned to the original location from where it was taken, this being the shrine in Darkfathom Cave. Now we should move on to discussing the curse of Sheogorath. So Sheogorath was not always Sheogorath, the god of madness. Instead, there was a time before Sheogorath, this being in the time before history. So who was Sheogorath if he was not the god of madness? Well, he was his opposite, Jiggalag, the god of order. So in the time before history, the god of order was becoming an increasingly more powerful Daedra. Now this would make the other Daedra jealous and also very concerned. With the expanding influence of Jiggalag, the other Daedric princes decided to take matters into their own hands. They would go on and curse Jiggalag, turning him into Sheogorath, his opposite, being the exact thing he had despised. And with this curse, only at the end of every era could he become his true form again. This would be during an event known as the Grey March, where he would retake the Shivering Isles from Sheogorath, attempting to remake the Plane of Oblivion. But of course, with the end of Grey March, he would once again transform back into Sheogorath, who would essentially further the madness in the Shivering Isles. So this is essentially the curse of Sheogorath. But does anyone worship his other form? Surprisingly, yes. Within the Shivering Isles, Jiggalag does actually have some worshippers, these being those who have betrayed Sheogorath. So the mortal inhabitants that have betrayed Sheogorath are known as the Priests of Order. This being as Jiggalag represents Order and Sheogorath represents the opposite, along with the Daedra they summon, which are known as the Knights of Order. This makes up the group of worshippers in the Shivering Isles known as the Forces of Order. They work with Jiggalag against Sheogorath. He does not have other known worshippers as he is more of a hidden Daedric prince, due to the fear of other Daedric princes, this being exactly why they cursed him. Now that we know about who Sheogorath is, his legacy, who worships him, his creations, and his curse, we have one thing left to answer. This being the question, so why would anyone actually choose to worship Sheogorath? Well, when it comes to Sheogorath, there are several reasons. One of these being desperation. We see this in the story of Talem Rend. His calling upon and making deals with Sheogorath was due to the desperation and guilt that came along with him killing his own son. Talem knew that Sheogorath had the ability to take the memories away, but he also knew that he was not good and was not to be trifled with, as Sheogorath was also known for tormenting people, not really known for helping them. But Talem was desperate to take away the pain and the guilt that came along with the death of his son. So this is why he willingly turned to Sheogorath. Whereas with others like the Chima or Dunmer worship of him and the early Khajiit worship of him, Sheogorath, he was more about testing people. The Khajiits believed he was important in testing their beliefs on their way to the right place in Oblivion. So when it comes to the worship of Sheogorath, some see him as a way to remove their pains, whereas others see him as a way to overcome it. Whereas with the various Daedric artifacts he creates, those who desire them desire power. After all, the Wabbajack can cause sudden death to those it hits, on occasion. That is, if one is willing to deal with the side effects. Or in other cases, they may be just a little Sheogorath touched, like the Zealot cult. But who isn't missing a few marbles these days? For every person who worships Sheogorath, it will be different, but in many cases it comes out of desperation, insanity, or just the desire for power. So let me know in the comments, would you worship Sheogorath and why? If you enjoyed this video, then you will enjoy this one. It is about the Mages Guild in the Elder Scrolls and what may have led them to dissolving.